I am Domingo Hernandez Gomez, and on behalf of the Bob and Alicia Woodrick Center for Equity and Inclusion at Grand Rapids Community College, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our 23rd annual Diversity Lecture Series. We are very honored to have Dr. John Cacioppo tonight with us as a speaker. Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge members of our Board of Trustees who are here tonight. First, I'd like to recognize Ms. Deb Bailey. If you would please stand. Thank you. Ms. Cynthia Bristol. We definitely appreciate all the work that our board does and their support for our equity and inclusion initiatives. The lecture series would not be possible without the support, the generous support of our of our sponsors. Our diversity champion sponsor this year is still CASE. Our diversity advocate sponsor is the GRCC Social Sciences Department. Our diversity partners are Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Michigan and Fountain Street Church. Our diversity supporters are Cascade Engineering, Experience Grand Rapids, Irwin Seating Company, Mercantile Bank, Spectrum Health, and Barnum. We are very grateful for these friends and supporters. If you'd like to make a donation tonight, there is a donation box at the information table. To introduce our speaker tonight, I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Vargo, Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Grand Rapids Community College.
Hello, and thank you. It's absolutely my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. As a young graduate student in psychology in the late 80s, I was particularly influenced by Dr. Cacioppo's work on persuasion and attitude change. In fact, my department chair, who also taught my first graduate course in social psychology, had a particular reverence and respect for Dr. Cacioppo's work. My chair was about the same vintage as Dr. Cacioppo and had also, like him, received attention for early career contributions to science, but you could tell in the way he would describe the research involved that my chair thought Dr. Cacioppo really had it going on. And 30 years later, it seems that my chair was absolutely correct. Dr. Cacioppo is one of the most influential and broadly cited psychologists in the field today. His seminal work in social neuroscience, the signal value of loneliness as an adaptive variable in our survival, the relationship between loneliness and gene expression, and a whole lot more. If you ever want to feel like you haven't gotten a lot out of a working day, just take a look at Dr. Cacioppo's curriculum vitae. This guy clearly gets a lot out of most working days. Particularly in the present day, as we are ever increasingly connected technologically, but counterintuitively, studies indicate that we've never felt more isolated and alone. With consequent increases in rates of physical and emotional health problems that are strongly connected to this loneliness, Dr. Cacioppo's work has never been more relevant or important. In addition to being founder of the field of social neuroscience and the author of more than 500 articles, chapters, and reviews, he has authored or edited more than 20 books, and his research has been funded continuously by the NSF and the NIH since 1978. Dr. Cacioppo is currently the Tiffany and Margaret Blake Distinguished Service Professor and founder and director of the Center for Cognitive and Social Neuroscience at the University of Chicago. What a great way to open this year's Diversity Lecture Series. Please join me in providing a very warm welcome to Dr. John Cacioppo.
Well, first, I want to thank Dean Vargo for that very kind introduction. And I want to say what an honor it is to be here today. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to speak today about a topic that we all have had experiences with, and that is of loneliness, and share with you some of the findings we have on its implications for health, both mental and physical, and for brain health. And it also is a topic that I came to because I wanted to understand who we were. What is our role? Where do we fit? And pretty quickly you realize we're fundamentally a social animal. We have this mythic, rugged individualism that we celebrate, but when you look at us as a species, we're fundamentally social animals. We are born to a period of abject dependency that's the longest for any mammal. For us to survive, human infants must instantly need to engage their parents in protective behavior, and the parents must care enough about these infants to protect them, to nurture them, and to support them. Even once grown, we're not a particularly formidable species. Other animals can run faster, see and smell better, and fight more effectively than we can as individuals. Our major evolutionary advantage is our brain and our ability to communicate, remember, plan, and work together. Our survival depends on our collective abilities, not on our individual might. In biology, there's a unique way of looking at behavior, and it's in terms of what they call fitness, the ability of genes to be passed along to future generations. And when you take that particular perspective, behaviors have one of four categories into which it will fall. Mutual benefit means that we both benefit from interacting. That's a social synergy. Helen Keller put it as follows: alone, we can do so little. Together, we can do so much. That's mutual benefit. Now, most animals engage in selfishness. They're out for themselves. It's their ability to survive and reproduce. Humans have that capacity, and some of our behaviors fall into that category as well. What's unique about social species, and especially about humans, is this mutual benefit, and the one to the right of that, the altruism. Spite is the opposite of altruism. That's it. I would be willing to go to a cost just to hurt you more. Each of these, there are behaviors that humans exhibit that can be found. And I might suggest, not just humans, we can find the same four types of behavior in bacteria. Bacteria, if you can believe it or not, are social animals, and there's been biologic research showing all four types in bacteria as well under certain conditions. The beauty of humans is that we've elaborated this so completely, and our genes are now shaped by our culture, which is something that is much more elaborate than in humans than in any other species. What that also means, though, is that much of what guides our behavior can be elusive, that is non-conscious to us. And so it's a topic that I've really enjoyed studying because so many results have been non-obvious. So I want you to just forget that for a moment and imagine. Imagine there's a condition that makes a person prickly, depressed, and self-centered. That affects approximately 1 in 3 people in America and affects 1 in 12 chronically and extremely. It's also a condition that's associated with a 26% increase in the odds of premature mortality. The condition is typically reversible, but common sense solutions are not helpful. The effects are not attributable to some characterological peculiarity of those affected by the condition, but rather are due to the effects of the condition on you and me and everyday people. Income, gender, ethnicity, education, and age are not protective, and the condition is contagious. There is such a condition. I've just described to you the condition of loneliness. Now, that's not how loneliness was thought to exist when I started research on this topic some 25 years ago, and it's not how the public thinks about this condition today. Early in the scientific study of loneliness, it was thought to be an aversive state with no redeeming features, barely different than depression, or being alone, or introversion, or neuroticism. We know all of these are incorrect now. And let me just show you some of the research we've done to show that these are incorrect. What I have depicted here is what's termed the Big Five Personality Inventory. It's thought to be this comprehensive way of describing the differences among people. And what I have in these bar graphs under each one, urgency is extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability is more commonly known as neuroticism, and openness. What the 3 bars under each dimension shows is people high, middling, and low in loneliness. This is how they score on these scales. Those are not different. We know these individuals to vary on a number of measures I will show you, but these are not actually different. That is, loneliness isn't related to these particular dimensions. This is the graph of lonely, and I hope you can see that, lonely and non-lonely individuals. These are about 5,000 undergraduates at Ohio State University. And you see from this that they differ in loneliness, in social support, in shyness, in social skills, in anger, anxiety, self-esteem, fear of being negatively evaluated, optimism, and mood. Lonely individuals score more negatively on all of those scales than non-lonely. Now, could that be because you have miserable, irritable people who others don't like and so they're lonely? Or does loneliness make you this way? The assumption was the former, not the latter, possibly due to poor attachment with your mother when you were very young. So we did something. We hypnotized a group of 21 individuals who were high hypnotizable, and we made the same individuals feel lonely or non-lonely. Then we flipped, and we made them feel the opposite. So what you see here is how those individuals scored on these same scales, the same scale on the ordinate, the same dimensions along the abscissa. The numbers look stunningly like the between subjects difference that I showed you in the top panel. These are not because of characterological differences. These are the same people in both lonely and non-lonely conditions. I'll tell you, this was a study I did very early because I want to know what's causal, not what's correlated. And I was stunned. Loneliness isn't those people. It's you and me when we feel isolated from others around us. Not when we are isolated. That correlation between whether you're isolated or whether you feel lonely is 0.19. It's a very weak correlation. It's when we feel isolated around others, our personality changes. And so I then started studying why, what's going on here. Now, in order to tell you this story, I want to tell you a little bit about the brain, because the brain does something that is underappreciated, right? So the human brain is not a particularly impressive organ when you look at it. I mean, this is it, and it fits in a bread box. And it's not a particularly pretty entity. But the human brain, each of our brains, contains about 86 billion neurons, about the number of stars in a galaxy. Each neuron makes about 5,000 synaptic connections each per neuron, giving you 430 trillion synaptic connections that are unique to each of your cranial vaults. That's an impressive array. Now, just to give you some idea of how big that number is, if you could count one connection per second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it would take you just over 13.6 million years to count all the connections. That's the human brain. Your consciousness, what you are aware of, is a small bit of what that brain is doing, and what that brain is doing that affects what you're thinking, what is conscious, and your behavior. So here you see the electromagnetic spectrum. You know that within the electromagnetic spectrum, there is a narrow band, and that's visible light. And those wavelengths determine, if you will, what color the cones in your eye respond to. So you have light coming through the retina. Back on the retina, you have this set of receptors. The rods tend to be in the periphery. They give you light dark. That's related to the amplitude of those wavelengths. And the middle are a lot of cones, which you see in the right panel there. And the wavelength stimulates, activates different receptors. And which receptors are activated then sends back color information. That's certainly you say, yeah, tell me something I don't already know. Well, if you will, look at the top line and think to yourself what color that is. Look at the second line. Think what color that is. The third line, the fourth line. Is there anyone here who sees all of those as the same color? No, they're 4 different colors, correct? Okay, let me show you what's actually there. They're not. The top 2 lines are green, the bottom 2 lines are orange. Now let me move this back again. You think, no, you're lying to me. I'm actually not lying to you. If you look, maybe I can show you. So right here, there's a small bar. That bar is the same color, top and bottom. You see that here. That's orange. Now watch that bar. Focus on either one. Watch that bar. They, in fact, are the same color. You don't perceive it that well because your conscious experience is not a function of the neural signals that came out of the retina and went to your brain. The brain is perceiving color differently than the wavelength. The wavelength is the starting point. It is not the perception. Your consciousness does not represent reality. These 2 tabletops, they look different, correct? They are precisely, exactly the same shape. Hard to believe? They are exactly the same shape. So let me just show you. I have the same illustration here. I can take this. You see that tabletop obviously covers. Let me show you something very quickly. Because this is such a remarkable illusion, it's actually hard to believe unless you see it. So no magic. You saw me move that. That same piece of paper exactly covers that other table now. Okay? Again, you're not seeing reality. You're seeing functionality. I'll give you another example. Your tongue. You probably know you have taste receptors, bitter, sweet, sour, and they are distributed across your tongue. This is where the preponderance is. You can taste 1 part to 200 parts water, 1 part sweet to 200 parts water. That's how sensitive your sweet taste buds are. That's pretty impressive. Bitter, 1 in 2 million. It's 10,000 times more sensitive than are the sweet receptors. Does anyone might want to conjecture why that's the case? Yes, bitter is associated with poisons. Those of our potential forebears who did not have this bias, who had a more accurate perception of reality, died of poison. Those who were 10,000 times more sensitive survived because they spit out Brussels sprouts. They spit out edible food when they were hungry, but they also spit out a number of poisons and went on to survive. It isn't reality, it's functionality. Our brain is doing that processing. You're aware of the end. You're aware of it being bitter. You're aware of it being sweet. You don't know the difference in those two. We don't have access to that information. Your brain is doing all of that, and it's doing that because across evolution, it's been sculpted to do that by natural selection. Loneliness, like physical pain, is ancient, it's atypical, and it's functionally adaptive as a temporary condition. Physical pain evolved long before humans walked the earth because it was an aversive signal that indicated you were doing damage to your physical body. So stop doing what you're doing. Right? That's good for our survival. There are people, by the way, born without physical pain system intact, and they live miserable lives because they don't know when they're hurting themselves. They don't know when they're walking across something that's cutting them or when they've broken a bone. And so they incur grave damage to their body because of the absence of this signal. Loneliness is an aversive pain that calls your attention to another need. That is the integrity of your social body, which we also need as social animals to survive and prosper for the very reason that Helen Keller said. We need others to survive and prosper in this world. We need these salutary, these healthy relationships with others where we engage in mutual benefit. Without those, we're in the more likely to be subject to selfishness on the part of others. And then, of course, we're left to that. Now, we're not the only animal. Loneliness not only is sad, it's a dangerous condition for a social animal. If you're a herd animal and you get called off from the herd, you're in trouble. And the elk's brain isn't sitting there thinking about this. It's evolved to immediately respond in a self-preservation mode. We do the same thing. Our brain converts to a self-preservation mode, and we're completely unaware of it, are the effects of that. It is phylogenetically so old. This self-preservation can be found in other animals, including rodents. This is a rat. If a rat is group housed, as is typical, and you put it in a box like this is a model for open field exploration, it explores. It walks around the middle, it walks around the outside. If that rat is isolated for 2 weeks and then put in that box, it walks around the outside. It doesn't go into the middle. Why? Because rats are subject to flying predators. The safest place it can be is close to the outside walls. Okay? And so we see this loneliness doing the same thing in these animals. It does that to our brain as well. Loneliness triggers changes in brain state and behavior, and a subset, it changes our consciousness. We become aware of this aversiveness, we feel bad. Those are the two most salient things that it does to our consciousness. That's just the tip of the iceberg of what it really does. So as a biological signal, we need these relationships. It motivates us to either repair or replace. So it motivates us to go toward and replace those relationships that are damaged or lost. However, we predate each other. We're not only the source of great good, we're the source of great evil and exploitation. So an unfettered tendency to approach another individual who may not be trustworthy can not only be harmful to you, it can be fatal. So the self-preservation mode is triggered. It promotes a set of consequences. One, it increases your what's called implicit vigilance, a non-conscious attentional state looking for social threats. You're completely unaware that your brain is doing this. And an increase in the extent to which an individual responds in a fashion that reflects his or her own interests rather than the collective interests. That is, engages in selfishness, self-preservation, rather than mutual benefit. These changes also trigger, and I will show you, a set of biological effects that serve to promote your short-term survival should a threat in fact appear. But when we become chronically lonely, these changes increase the wear and tear on the body and lead to premature mortality. These mortal effects are increasingly obvious now because we are living longer than ever before. We have an aging society. And it's not because of baby boomers. It's because, for instance, we have fewer infant deaths, we have lower birth fertility rates, and we have longer lifespans. And so we're seeing these deadly costs of chronic conditions like loneliness now more than we ever have before in human history. So I want to give you a sense in which you're attending to these processes, and not only are you unaware, you can't stop it. So I hope it works in this setting, but I'd like you to look at the list of letter strings I'm going to show and tell me what color each letter string, there's words, just from top to bottom. Don't bother with reading the words, just what color is each word printed in. Ready? Okay, but that's actually supposed to be orange. It is on my screen. So blue, orange, green, red. Okay, let's do exactly the same thing. You ready? Okay, how many found that to be harder? How many could feel that that was harder? Okay, you're normal. In fact, the people who don't have problems with this are the people who don't know English. And that's because you're such proficient readers. You're such good readers. You've read your whole life. Your brain is reading those words without your awareness. Now, not so much that it breaks into consciousness, but enough that if you're trying to do something like, say, the color, and it contrasts with what the word is, it interferes with your ability to name the color. And if you try not to do it, it doesn't help. So your brain is doing things of which you're unaware and you can't control. So here's what we did. We presented a list of words that look like this to lonely and non-lonely individuals. So negative and positive, social and non-social. And what we found was that lonely individuals took longer to name the color in which negative social words were printed. What does that mean? It means when you become lonely, your brain pays special attention to negative social events. Negative social stimuli. Okay? Let me show you another. I'm not sure where this is a gene. So what I'm trying to show you here are two pictures. We have a negative social picture and a negative non-social picture. Now, there were many dozens of such pictures in a study that we did where we were also doing electrical neuroimaging. So there's 128 of these sensors on the scalp. And basically, if you were a subject, you'd be sitting there with this on, and you'd look at this crosshair, then you'd see one of those pictures for a second. And you would be asked to rate it, and then there was a variable blank, and then you'd see the fixed crosshairs again and again and again for hundreds of pictures. All right? That's the paradigm. What do we look at? Well, we're looking at non-lonely and lonely participants, and we're now looking at the brain's electrical activity and where that electrical activity is coming from in terms of the brain and how it's the same or different when they're looking at negative social and negative non-social pictures. All right? And what you see here is for the first 250 milliseconds, thousandth of a second, for the first quarter second, your brain does 5 different cognitive operations on that stimulus. You're not aware of it. This is before you can even become aware of something. But your brain's already operating on it, and it does that whether it's a social or non-social stimulus. And then at about a quarter of a second, that brain distinguishes between the social and the non-social negative stimuli. That's what I'm showing you here. What about the lonely brains? Within less than half that time, lonely brains, really high in the priority, have distinguished negative social from non-negative non-social. That's fast. Now, you don't do this if your brain isn't already looking for that kind of distinction. Give you another example. Now we're into functional magnetic resonance imaging. You've all seen these kinds of magnets. One of the things that we looked for was when you first get placed in this magnet, you just lay there for 10 minutes while we get things ready to show you. Well, what we're doing is we're also recording your activity. And that's called resting state. What does your brain look like when you're not doing anything? You're just sitting there. And so we looked at lonely and non-lonely brains. This was actually a study done in Italy. We're looking at non-lonely and lonely brains at rest. And what we see is the connectivity in that resting brain revealed your brain, if you're lonely, is on high alert compared to non-lonely. Your brain's alertness network, alertness attentional network, it's the frontal region and the lateral region, it's called the orbicular, singular orbicular network, is on high alert. So you're not doing anything, your brain is doing something. If you're lonely, it's attending, it's looking, it's surveilling. The blue nodes are a self-regulation network, and that goes down when you're lonely. Why? If you're in a crisis situation, that's a bad time to learn. That's a good time to do what you already know. And that's basically low self-regulation. You're going with what's called the dominant response, the overlearned response, the impulsive response. So self-regulation is lower, and the network is diminished even at rest. Now, we're now showing them pictures. Negative and positive, social and non-social pictures. I'm going to focus on the negative here. What you see is in the lonely brain, looking at a negative social picture, controlling for this, the visual cortex is particularly active. Now, lonely and non-lonely people are looking at these images. They have no trouble identifying that as a negative social picture. But the lonely brain is paying, if you will, more attention. That part of the brain is more active. The visual stream moves forward. These blue areas, called the temporal parietal junction, that's an area that's involved in the attentional processes of being able to take someone else's perspective, being able to consider how they feel, empathy, or what they're thinking, theory of mind. It's involved in all of those. In that area, lonely brains are less active. They're more active to the negative stimulus. They're paying less attention to what the other person feels. Why? Because their brain is in self-preservation mode. They're thinking about, someone got attacked, I need to take care of myself. I don't have mutual benefit around me. Self-preservation mode. Well, you can tell from the way I'm telling this story, they don't know that their brain is that way. They don't know why they decide to run instead of go to the aid of someone else. But it's predictable based on the story I'm telling you. This is just to show you that blue area is involved, that same region is involved in a variety of theory of mind tests. So one of the implications that we've recently examined is, if you become lonely, do you become more self-centered? I mean, not that you would tell us you're more self-centered, not that you're aware of it, but do you begin acting in a way where you focus more on your interests than the concerns and interests of those with whom you're interacting? And so I started this population-based, which means it's a random selection of people from Cook County, a third African-American, a third Euro-American, a third Latino-American, born between 1935 and 1952. And we followed them for 10 years. And this is a complex set of equations. What I want to show you is, across 10 years, people varied in terms of their level of loneliness. It went up and down. It would in any of us as circumstances in their lives change. This line represents self-centeredness. All of these represent various covariates that are controlling for potential alternative explanations. And what the math showed very clearly was loneliness leads to an increase in self-centeredness. Nobody can self-report this, but their brain changes and their behavior changes accordingly. I suggested earlier that loneliness makes you feel sad. This is among the studies that we've done that shows that. Same population-based study that was done earlier than the last one, so we only had 5 years at that point. Loneliness leads to depressive behavior. Now, these have an evolutionary benefit. What's the advantage of becoming self-centered? If you're lonely, that means you can't trust those around you. You don't have those healthy relationships available to you. If something bad happens, if there's a challenge that arrives, you have selfishness as your evolutionary or biological imperative. You're not choosing to do this. Your brain has been shaped, just like your tongue, to put you into that mode, because that increases the likelihood that your genes will be passed along, just like the bitter receptors in your tongue. It makes you, if you will, more bitter for that moment when it comes to social interactions. Well, the sadness also has an adaptive value. Sadness is associated with two consequences that are adaptive in this setting. If I'm in a group and that group rejects me, or I want to be on a team and I'm the last to be selected, I might want to try to fight my way in or object. Sadness does two things. One, it reduces your energy levels, so you're less likely to want to fight, and it leads to expressions, vocal, postural, facially expressive, that is a silent but safe call to others in the social environment. If you want to connect, please do so now. If you've ever had a child that you put into timeout and you heard them cry, you know that's a test of your self-regulation capacities to not go hug that child immediately. It's hard to not go and embrace someone who's in misery like that. And I mentioned it's contagious. This is the Framingham, Massachusetts population expressed as a social network. We followed them for 10 years. And what we found was that those on the edge were more likely to be lonely, but not because they started there. They might start in the middle, and then they started to interact with friends in a more negative fashion. If you interact with someone in a negative fashion, you're not going to retain them as friends if that continues. It continued, so they stop being your friend. And when they have a negative interaction expressed toward them, they're more likely to interact with someone else later in a negative fashion. And that means they're likely to lose not only you as a friend, but someone else they interacted with later. And so it gets transmitted behaviorally. It's a virus that's transmitted by how we interact with others. Now, I mentioned earlier that chronic loneliness is a major risk factor. This comes from a meta-analysis of 70 prospective studies involving more than 3 million participants around the world. The average follow-up was 7 years, and they found a 26% increase in premature mortality, even after controlling for factors like demographics and whether you were actually alone or not. That's after controlling for those factors. Mental health. I just showed you evidence that loneliness leads to increased depressiveness, it leads to increased anxiety, and all the attendant problems there. And brain health. Loneliness in animals and in humans, in experiments, leads to lower levels of nerve growth factors, lower rates of neurogenesis. That's nerve growth in your brain. Higher levels of cell death following an infarct. That is, if you have a mini stroke and you feel lonely, that's more likely to lead to cell death in your brain, 3 times more likely. And lower levels, it increases dementia. And that we believe to be related to the prior. And the mechanism here is neuroinflammation. Loneliness, as I'll show you, increases inflammation. Inflammation in the brain can be a very deadly process. It increases your likelihood of dementia and death. What's the prevalence? It's about 20 to 60, and this is in industrialized nations worldwide. It's about 20 to 60%, 1 in 2 in some cases, report feeling lonely at least some of the time. And 5 to 10% say frequently or always. That's about the same rate as many of our major physical risk factors like smoking, excessive drinking, and obesity. And the effect size is comparable to obesity on mortality. So how is this happening? What is it about loneliness that's doing this? Well, this graphic is meant to capture a lot, but this is the set of columns I'd like to focus on. When you become lonely, the brain triggers 5 different sets of pathways. It decreases sleep salubrity. You have more micro-awakenings, you have less slow-wave sleep, and I'll explain why in just a moment. You get dysregulated hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical activation. Big word, what it means is your stress hormones get juiced. Now, not because you're exposed to a stressor, but because you might be, and now, without others to help you, you need to be ready. You need to be able to respond. Selective sympathetic tonus, another fancy neural mechanism, but that's a fight or flight response. And it doesn't change all of your readiness to fight or flee. It changes selectively in a way that impacts your blood pressure, your resistance, and gene expression. So next is transcriptome dynamics. You have about 2,500 genes, but they're not all turned on. Which ones are turned on and off depends partly on your developmental history and, as we learn more and more every day, on what's going on right now, including your feeling of isolation or loneliness. When you feel that you don't have that safe relationships, your brain and body, including the genes that are being turned on, start to mobilize so that if a challenge arises or a pathogen arises, you're able to defend against that. One of the things it does is to increase inflammation in case you incur an injury. that's good for the immune system to get the needed cells to the site of the injury. It also changes the pathogen that it's sensitive to, from viruses, which you get in socially affine circumstances, to bacteria, which you can incur when by yourself. Viruses get transmitted through interactions with people, through body fluids. I sneeze, I shake your hand, you scratch your eye. Now, of course, we have air travel. That changes everything. But in the past, you had to be in a socially close environment to be exposed to viruses. So viral protection goes down in loneliness. What do we see on college campuses? Our lonely subjects are much more likely to get those respiratory infections. We did an experiment with monkeys. We have animal models as well. We find the animals that are lonely, and we have a way of testing that, actually show poor responses to viral exposure that are non-lonely animals. I mentioned this inflammatory substrate, and that's because of the genes that are being turned on. Those genes are called NF-kappa B transcripts. They produce pro-inflammatory molecules called cytokines. That's inflammation. And it has an adaptive purpose in the short term. In the long term, it's not at all healthy. Prepotent responding, that's this impulsive responding, that goes up because your brain is in an emergency circumstance. And depressive symptoms, which I've already mentioned. Now let me just talk about one of these as a model for what's operating at all 8. Sleep salubrity. I actually did this study shortly after I had done our first study of loneliness because it looked like a lot was going on that subjects were unaware of and nobody had ever talked about. And I thought, if that's really true, because people like me don't believe non-conscious processes are operating unless there's really clear evidence. So I thought, this can't be. I said, okay, let's try to disconfirm. If this is operating and it's dangerous to fend off wild beasts by yourself with a stick, it's going to be very dangerous to lay down at night, put that stick down, and go to sleep when predators are out and you don't have a safe social surround. I said, so if that's the case, we should find loneliness impairs sleeping. And so we brought in participants, put them in a hospital room by themselves, lonely or non-lonely. The nurses didn't know who was who. The experimenters didn't know which was which. The subject didn't know they were in the experiment because of their level of loneliness. And we measured sleep overnight. To make sure it wasn't just because of a hospital effect, we also measured their sleep in their residence hall for 5 additional nights. What we found was the lonelier the participant, the more micro-awakenings occur. They think they awaken, they're tired. They didn't think they had slept very well. They slept the same number of hours. They didn't sleep as soundly because of these micro-awakenings. This is our young adults. This is our older adults. This is a self-report scale. Lonely individuals are reporting a host of sleep problems. Now, if you wake up and you're tired, you're going to assume that you didn't sleep as long. In fact, you do. But you're showing sleep fragmentation. There's now animal studies that have been done. Those animals, when they are made to feel lonely, get less slow-wave sleep. Slow-wave sleep is the soundest sleep. That's when you're not aware of anything in your environment. That's what's getting sacrificed in the lonely brain. Just more evidence that if we look, these are older adults, night by night. If you feel lonely tonight, you will sleep less well. You're more likely to wake up with fatigue tomorrow morning than if you feel less lonely. This is impossible to read, I realize now. What it shows you is those pathways on the left are those pathways and all the evidence that now exist to support those pathways in humans, and in the right column, in animals. Now, the right column is less sparse because for a long time, social factors were rejected by biology. They were thought to be too complicated to understand. Well, as you can see, with these animal models, we're now finding they're not too complicated to understand, and we're getting very clear experimental evidence that loneliness is causal. So let me just bring this to a summary really quickly. Loneliness, like physical pain, is an ancient and powerful atypical state that promotes an individual's survival. It automatically triggers neurobiological adjustments that range from sleep fragmentation to physiological activation to genes being turned on and off to changes in which behaviors are expressed. Within increased population density, population aging, and digital interactions, the likelihood of becoming and remaining lonely has increased over the past few decades. These neurobiological adjustments promote short-term self-preservation, but over time, these adjustments have deleterious effects on physical, mental, and brain health. What do we do about it? Well, there's been this notion that digital connections are replacing face-to-face connections, and we have more connections, more friends, more contacts. We're more social than ever before. Is that true? Or is Facebook and other social network devices making us more lonely? The answer is, think about this social network, your computer, your cell phone, as a tool. Just like your car is a tool. It's not doing anything on its own. It's how you're using it. If you drive your car around to see your friends and family and you post a wave to them as you drive by, that's going to make you feel more lonely. If you use your car to drive to your family and friends, to share good times with them, that's going to make you feel less lonely. That's exactly what we see in the digital network literature as well. If you use Facebook as a destination, you stop there. You curry lots of friends on Facebook, but you have no face-to-face interactions, it makes you more lonely. If you use it as a way station to leverage your friendships, to stay in contact, and then to visit those friends again, it decreases your loneliness. That's basically the literature. There's an exception that Frank and I talked about. If you're really, really isolated, and surprisingly to me, there are some older adults who are so isolated, their major worry, and it's an existential concern that's very real to them, is that they will pass and no one will even know that they died, and their body will rot with no one discovering it for months. For those individuals, any connection is better than none. Because if I'm on Facebook and then I pass, at least somebody is likely to ask, what happened to John? And start looking for me. And that provides some comfort. Happily, that level of loneliness, most of us don't have to deal with. So what kind of interventions work? If it's not just put them on Facebook, what does work? Well, the most obvious is they're lonely, put them with other people. The mixtures at colleges are based on this model. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. We did a statistical analysis of all of the possible interventions. This doesn't work, but now you know why. If you're lonely and your brain has gone to a slightly more defensive, prickly stance, the worst thing to do is to interact with another lonely person who's prickly and defensive, because the two of you, after a while, don't like each other. And so, for instance, Denmark is working on this. We worked with their foundation, and they wanted to do this even though we advised it wouldn't work, and they implemented it because they were convinced it made such intuitive sense. Well, we went back 2 years later and asked them, how did this work out? And they said, well, the people said they liked it, but they quit coming and they didn't get less lonely. Well, that's exactly what you would expect. Another, social skills. If people have terrible social skills, yes, they're more likely to be lonely. When you look at the population writ large, if you look at a big swath of people, social skills are not the problem. They have good social skills. When you get lonely, you think about yourself, not others. You will show poor social skills. When we did the hypnotist study, we hypnotized people, made them feel lonely. They showed poor social skills. They did not have poor social skills. They showed poor social skills because they weren't thinking of others. So the training is training them something they can already do. Social support. Well, if this worked, patients wouldn't be lonely in hospitals because they can press a button. They have tangible support, emotional support, appraisal support, and yet they feel lonely. It's not about being with others. It's about being with others you want to be with. And social cognition. This is actually the right approach, and the research was fairly sparse, but it looked like it would work best. So we did some work. Oh, I might mention before I go on to the next, we did some work on the social cognition. But when we did that work, we found there are some individuals who are so lonely and so well defended, you can't even talk to them. They just don't want to hear from you. They've already withdrawn. And so Stephanie Cacioppo, also on the faculty at the University of Chicago and in the School of Medicine, has been looking at a brain steroid that the animal research, and she now in humans, has identified as being deficient when you feel lonely. And she's has an ongoing clinical trial to see if allopregnanolone, this brain steroid, will actually help alleviate that loneliness enough so that the cognitive reframing will then work with these individuals. So we have done a couple studies now on this social cognition training. We call it social fitness training. And we worked initially with the U.S. Army because of the high suicide rates that was seen in the soldiers after 2001. What is less well known is that loneliness was a major predictor of who was committing suicides. And so we started to work with this group and developed training that proved effective. I just want to show you one or two small instances. And it's really just is about informing what's actually going on. If you don't have access to it, like if I'm going to take my self-interest in a negative circumstance, but I'm aware of that, then I can stop. And I can say, wait, maybe it isn't the circumstance, maybe the people are trusting. I just have to act differently. And so I can turn around and start taking interest in someone who got injured or was harmed and not fear for my own survival. So this social synergies means mutual benefit is an option. What social synergies? Joint action, like moving furniture. Think about moving furniture. Trying to do this by yourself will damage the floor, break the furniture, and hurt your back. One other person makes this possible. But imagine that you got one other person and you had that person move half the furniture and you moved half the furniture. That makes no sense, does it? Now notice, you would do it in half the time, but both of you would likely scratch the floor, break the furniture, and hurt your backs. So that's not even an option. It's obvious we should move it together. That's a social synergy. We can do that a lot more often than just moving furniture. We just don't think about how to do that. It's a source of diversity. That's also a source of synergy that we underestimate. So I just want to walk through, just to illustrate how diversity can make us stronger, make us better, make us actually more powerful, this mutual benefits. It is our differences that make us stronger. So let's assume we have a decision committee. They're going to decide on who to hire as, if you will, the dean. Okay? And you've got 4 different people representing 4 very different departments within the college because you want those specialized views represented. Okay, so we've got 2 candidates, Sam and Amari. And what we know about them is that this first individual thinks Sam is better because of reasons A and B, and Amari is better because of reason C. That's just what this individual thinks. The second individual thinks the same thing, except it's not because of reason C, it's because of reason D. This person, better because of A and B, E, A and B, F. What you see A and B represent is common knowledge. What D through F represents, or C through F represents, is specialized knowledge. They're there because of the specialized knowledge that they can bring. We all bring common knowledge to an event, but specialized knowledge comes from diverse representation. What unfortunately happens all too often, diversity doesn't have to, or it doesn't automatically make us better. It has the potential to make us better. We might think this way, but because we all think that Sam is better than Amari by 2 to 1 in our own minds, what's somebody going to say? I think Sam is better. And as soon as they hear that, the other says, I think that too, I think that as well, I think that as well. We're in agreement, no reason to waste our time. They hire Sam. But of course, if one of them had said, wait, I think Amari's good because of this reason, and they all get that out, what they'll find out is, oh, actually, Amari's better 2-to-1. And you make the opposite decision. Diversity is a strength, but we have to capitalize on it. And that's the real challenge in social fitness. You can open that dialogue up, and the beauty of the human brain is that that is all I have to say, and your brain, hopefully you included in this conversation, will start to percolate, will start to think about it. And the next time you're in a setting and it seems like there's an obvious solution, perhaps stop for a moment and say, okay, it seems obvious, let's consider everything, let's consider more points of view, and see if we can come up with something better. The research on minority influence in groups has shown time and time again, even if the minority position is not right, it leads to better decisions because everybody is forced to sit and give the decision a second thought and consider more options. Confirmatory biases, trying to confirm what we already think, is an anathema in science, and it's an anathema, it's not capitalizing all the synergies that are available in our lives as well. And one of the stories we're learning in the research on loneliness is that we can solve not only feelings of loneliness, but have a more inclusive society by capitalizing on those different points of views rather than sorting by those points of view. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions. Hi. I didn't hear a question, however. That was a statement. Was there a question as well? No. Okay, thank you.
Any questions? Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your research on this present topic. So what are some indications of loneliness that we can be aware of?
Thank you. So thank you for the question. The effects that we're most aware of are the aversiveness of it, and that's, if you appreciate what it's doing, it's really the signal to take your time away from where you're placing it and put it on your social relationships. Attend to those. I had an undergraduate at the University of Chicago who had good friends back in high school, was the only one who traveled, who left kind of the community. The others had gone to college nearby. And he stayed up with them on Facebook, and he said, I realized I was getting lonelier and lonelier. And so he stopped, he went out, he made friends at the University of Chicago, then he went back, and he could actually enjoy both sets of friends in that fashion. So that aversiveness, if he had not interpreted it correctly, would have led to a worsening rather than an improvement to that situation. So one is to appreciate just what it's doing. Secondly, loneliness is incredibly stigmatized. When we worked with the Army soldiers, we could not use the word loneliness because warriors will have no part of that. Nobody's lonely. They were killing themselves, but nobody's lonely, right? So it's to appreciate that this is not loners, this is not that kid, it's not something about them, it's a part of you and me. And it's what gives us our humanity. That's actually something that's not well appreciated. If we didn't value our relationships, if others didn't matter to us, we wouldn't be lonely. It is because others matter, because we have those connections. That's what gives us our humanity. People who feel lonely and isolated not only see others as threats, they're more likely to aggress against those others. And in the extreme circumstances, they also aggress against themselves. That's where suicide comes from. Right? So it's to appreciate what that signal means, because our culture doesn't have it exactly right. We need to appreciate that this rugged individualism is mythic, but it's not real. Social animals, including humans, when they're young, want to grow up to be less dependent. But they don't grow up wanting to be independent. They become the one on whom others can depend. That defines an adult in social species. We don't have it quite right in the sense of, I just want to become the biggest, baddest, I want to be the captain of the team, king of the mountain, and not care about others. That's actually not what we are built to be as a species. And that's the kind of understanding I hope that research like this can actually start promoting.
I have two questions, if you don't mind. The first one, I was curious when you describe your research models.
Can you speak into the mic, please?
Sorry.
Yeah.
When you were describing your research models for some of the experiments that you did, how did you stratify your patients as to lonely or not lonely?
How do we differentiate? How do we measure? Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. There's a variety of different consequences of loneliness that we've found. But none of those are as diagnostic as surveys that we give them to complete. But in those surveys, we never ask, do you feel lonely? We never use the word lonely. We never use the word loneliness, because people underreport. Not just soldiers. Soldiers certainly underreport. But just generally, people know loneliness to be something that is not right. And they don't want to be not right. And so they underreport. But there are other questions. I feel in tune with those around me. There are others with whom I can speak and confide. Those kinds of questions map beautifully into loneliness.
So like targeted, but not necessarily specific, yes or no?
Right. Now, when we're doing animal studies, we use behavioral measures. But I have back-translated those behavioral measures. So the rhesus monkey is one of our models. What we do with rhesus monkeys behaviorally to identify, we've done with humans, and it maps into loneliness. It's just not as fine. So the distinctions are gross rather than very fine grained.
My second question relates to pharmacological therapies. Aside from the clinical trial that you were talking about, have you seen any research or experiences yourself with other pharmacological treatments, like just your mood stabilizers or your SSRIs or traditional antidepressants?
Yeah, so SSRIs aren't particularly good, and many SSRIs don't work because of serotonin. They work because of allopregnanolone. And so that's actually an interesting feature about allopregnanolone. It's a fairly novel neurosteroid. Not many people know much about it, but it seems to be a particularly important neurosteroid for this. It's one of a handful of neurosteroids that loneliness actually changes its distribution. The other drugs that have been used are drugs that alleviate pain. So opiates, even acetaminophen, lowers your feeling of loneliness. However, it lowers your feelings of anything positive as well. It just it deadens everything. And so it's not a treatment that anyone would actually want to use unless you just want to have, if you feel lonely, you'll settle for deadening your feelings. That's not a particularly healthy way to get over it, though. So something like allopregnanolone doesn't change your affective states. It operates specifically on this brain's feeling of loneliness, which you need to kind of lower in order to get through to people who are really already badly and chronically lonely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for being here. I had two questions. One was, what led you to go into this field? And obviously, be the head person and go-to guy. I'm just curious, was it something that happened in school or just a love of data and numbers? Being inquisitive?
I've learned over the years that if there were such a story, I would be a much more sympathetic figure. It actually isn't that. What happened was in 1992, I proposed a interdisciplinary scientific field called social neuroscience. And social neuroscience is the study of brain function looking at the neural, hormonal, cellular, and molecular mechanisms that are responsible for the structures and processes that define social species, superorganismal structures and processes, right? Think about a pair bond or a mother-infant attachment. That is a superorganismal structure. Communication, that is a superorganismal process. So the metaphor I used for the brain and studying brain function was the cell phone, not the solitary computer. And you ask different questions, all right? So I laid that out in 92, and then the question next for me was, how do we create a program of research that illustrates exactly how powerful those social connections are to brain and biology, all right? And you think about social species from a biological perspective, the defining feature of a social species is that the animals engage in sufficiently reliable interactions with conspecifics, other animals, that you can identify structures and relationships, like a mother-infant relationship or pair bond, right? These are biologic terms, right? And then you can, that defines that social species. So my approach, and in neurosciences, this is an approach. If I want to understand something, you look at when it's there, and you look at when it's absent. Have you heard of a knockout mouse, a knockout gene mouse? You have a mouse that's normal, and you have a mouse that's identical except for one gene. Now, you're not interested really in the absence of that gene. You're interested in what is the difference between those two mice, and from having this one without that gene, you learn what that gene might be doing. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker in the 1860s. He was working on the railroad, setting a charge, and the blasting cap went off, rocketing his tamping iron through his eyes, obliterating the orbital frontal cortex and out the top of the skull. He lost the orbital frontal cortex, and his behavior changed, his personality changed forever. That was not because of disease, it was because of no longer having that orbital frontal cortex. We are interested in that story because it tells us not about the whole, but about what that cortex was doing before it was lost. So I thought, okay, I'm going to take the same method of deletion approach. We'll look at people with these connections and without. And we look at objective isolation, and we look at perceived isolation. And the reason we also looked at perceived is if there's one thing we know about the brain, as I showed you with the tongue and with the tables, is reality isn't nearly what the brain is doing. It converts that to functionality. From that, you have to look at what the brain perceives, not what is there. And so that's how I went about studying this. I started studying it, and someone said, you know, perceived isolation is called loneliness. And I said, what? That's how I became a loneliness researcher.
All right. My second question is probably a little bit easier, but if there was one piece of literature that you could suggest people to read about your field, what would that be? Wow.
Now, that's a question I have never been asked. So, first of all, thank you for such a great question. Sir Arthur Eddington, so this may strike you as an odd answer, but Sir Arthur Eddington was an astrophysicist. He was the astrophysicist who provided the first empirical evidence to support Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. All right? And in 1939, he wrote a book called The Philosophy of the Physical Sciences. You can scratch off physical, it's a beautiful book. And he tells stories in that book about how we should conduct science that I would apply to how we should live as socially fit individuals. Looking for what we want rather than what is, trying to find what isn't, and finding disconfirmations of what we expect as an opportunity to grow rather than as a disappointment is profound. And if we lived, and it's true in science, if you come in and you confirm your hypothesis, you don't learn anything. It's the disconfirmations that force you to grow, to learn something we didn't know before. Now, the modal scientist does not believe that, does not act like that. The modal scientist also publishes one article per year. Or no, one article across their career, excuse me. It's a very, kind of skewed distribution. Those who look for disconfirmation are more likely to actually advance knowledge. That's true in our everyday life as well. And so it's uncomfortable, but we're deal well with uncomfortable. With those challenges, we grow rather than stay the same. So that's why I would recommend that book. Go ahead.
Hi. So if loneliness impairs sleep, does that mean that cortisol levels are changed at all?
Can you say that once more? You're talking about cortisol, right? So
if loneliness affects your sleep,
yes.
That creates more stress. So does that change cortisol levels?
Yes, so loneliness increases cortisol before the loss of sleep. It particularly increases morning rise in cortisol, but it also makes for a flatter cycle. So cortisol is a big stress hormone. It's a steroid. And it's controlled by the amygdala and the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. If you know this, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis is a very small area in your brain, but it's involved in context learning. So if you shine a light and then you shock me, I'm going to become fearful of that light, and I will flinch as soon as you show the light. That's the result of the amygdala, and if you do it enough, I'm likely to show cortisol changes to that light. If you shine a light, but you don't shock me, but there's a context, there's a particular setting, a room, and I get shocked in that room, then I'm likely to show fear and higher cortisol, but that's the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. Loneliness is the latter. It isn't a response to a stressor, it's preparing for a stressor. And so you have to have elevated cortisol so that your body is already revved up. That's also the sleep fragmentation. So we see this in humans and in non-human animals. In non-human animals, it's corticosteroid instead of cortisol. It's a slightly different but related molecule.
Okay, so does that mean that loneliness also affects the anterior cingulate cortex?
So the singular opercular network that I call the alertness network,
right.
The singular in that is from the anterior cingulate.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure, thank you.
Thank you for being here. I work for a cardiovascular prevention disease program that targets particularly immigrant communities, that being the Spanish-speaking community. And having been an immigrant and felt lonely for many, many years, I wonder if you have specific, or the 3 top specific pieces of advice that I can convey to my participants in this primary prevention program.
Well, first, loneliness comes in a lot of forms, as I'm sure you're aware, and so there isn't a magic bullet. With the Army, we had 50 training exercises that we put them through, and even then we found there were crusty old soldiers who were just impenetrable, which is why, that's what interested my wife and I in this allopregnanolone, which she had already found in some of her neurological reviews of the literature. But there's a little bit that I would say. First, realizing that your brain goes into this self-preservation mode gives us cause to reflect before we react to others, to be a little more forgiving of others and what we might hear them say than we would otherwise be. Loneliness, because it increases the self-preservation, does make us prickly. So one advice I would give is do volunteer service. If you're serving people in a food kitchen, you will see gratitude like you don't see when walking down the street and just talking to someone, right? And that gratitude starts to open one's eyes to the fact that people actually like interacting and connecting. Connecting and cooperating activates the ventral striatum. It activates the dopamine-rich area of your brain. It's like getting paid. It's a reward. Just that juice of social connection. And so having that experience for someone who's really lonely can be eye-opening. So once that is there, then I would suggest ease, E-A-S-E. Extend yourself. When people are lonely for a long time, they tend to withdraw. They've already tried that. They know it doesn't work. It's punishing. It's me. It's them. I'm out of it. I'm not going to, because why put myself through that again and again? So extend yourself, but extend yourself in a safe way. The A is be aware of what's actually going on, the fact that our conscious experience may be misleading. Now, you want to protect these individuals, so I'm not saying trust everybody, because lonely individuals are also easily conned. They do want to connect. They have this resistance, so you can gain their trust pretty easily. So one has to not expect supernatural things, expect people to be natural. It's not about being supernatural, it's about being natural. That's the A. The S is, in this case, find people with similar attitudes, similar interests, similar activities. If I'm lonely, I'm not going to find someone I want to talk to at a sports bar. I'm more likely to find them in an academic meeting or a library, right? And so you've got to have common interests to get mutual benefits. And then lastly, expect the best. People are going to be negative to you sometimes. It doesn't mean the end of that relationship. Expect the best from them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. I'm one of 11 children, and my mother is starting to descend into Alzheimer's. And so I would say that most of her life she was not lonely. She always had many of us around her, 80 grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So what I find in working with her, as the loneliness increases with the Alzheimer's, is that when I bring her to music, that causes happiness and joy. Have you done any studies about music and loneliness?
There's an individual in New York City who's contacted us, who's using the arts as a treatment for loneliness. We were talking earlier about the joy of doing work, even solitary work, that you're going to share with others. That's why cooking is such a passion for so many people. It's not just the fun of preparing it, it's the fun of sharing it and seeing. If we were working in laboratories by ourselves, writing late at night, to share it with no one, I think that's why most papers get rejected. That's why that's so punishing, is you never get to share all the toil that you actually put into the effort. Painters have the same dilemma sometimes. The public doesn't appreciate what they've done, but when they do, it's immensely pleasurable. And so partly, I think, the act of participating in music is the mastery of being able to do it, but also the joy of sharing it with others. We are now working with a neurologist, looking at dementia, at Alzheimer's dementia, and their brains. And Alzheimer's isn't necessarily something that leads to increased. What we see in a recent analysis is that the diagnosis of Alzheimer's really makes people feel lonelier. It tends to go down a little bit after that. It settles down a little bit. Now, a lot of that's how the family reacts, but that initial diagnosis is a little bit like students coming to college. When they walk through those doors, the miles from home is a predictor of how lonely they're going to feel. That's relatively temporary, and then it goes back to a stable level. So that's some good news. This neuroinflammation, which we think contributes to the onset of Alzheimer's, doesn't responsible, but it makes it worse. We want to really pursue that effect, because if that's the case, there are ways for all of us to have better brain health through these periods. You had a question, please?
Two quick questions. I want to be really clear about your comments on Facebook. If I have more friends on Facebook, I would tend to be lonelier. If I'm engaged with a few friends, I would tend to be not lonely. Is
No,
that,
not exactly. I may have misstated,
Okay.
so let me be
I
clear.
need that to be clearer.
The number of friends on Facebook isn't predictive. Well, here's what they do find. They find that if you look at a simple correlation, the more friends on Facebook, the less lonely you are.
Say that again, please.
The less lonely. But here's why. They find that the people who have more friends on Facebook brought them with them. If you didn't bring them with you, you're not less lonely. So, not too surprisingly, someone with no friends goes on Facebook and has no friends. The addition of friends through Facebook that they don't really know and don't really interact with and may not even be representing themselves authentically, that doesn't make them feel less lonely. That's not helpful. So it's not friends on Facebook, it's friends in their lives with whom they interact.
Oh,
so if I use Facebook to stay connected with people and to say, look, I'm going to do this after the talk, let's get together at X.
Gotcha.
That makes me less lonely. If I use it as a replacement, if I'm going to go online and just get as many friends as possible, and I'm going to spend all my time there, and I actually knew a graduate student who did this.
Right.
It makes you more lonely. In fact, 2 years after he was doing this, he emailed me and says, I'm getting lonelier every day. And you're going, well, maybe get off Facebook. Right? Because there is this notion that digital connections are substitutable.
Yes.
If a child falls and scrapes its knee, Skype or Facebook posts will not make the child feel nearly as well as if the friend or parent is there to pick the child up.
Thank you.
We are wired in that fashion.
For clarifying
so that's what I was
that.
trying to say about it.
I loved your conclusion tonight where you brought in the diversity opinion within the group making better decisions. If I replace the word with diversity and say it's a healthy group, and I'm the dissident opinion in that group, is that word equivalent to diversity?
Yes.
Okay.
If you're a dissident, in fact, people don't necessarily like dissidents because we like comfort.
I understand that.
Right, but that dissident makes the group, on average, they make better decisions.
Gotcha. Thank you very much for being here. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, would you join me in thanking Dr. Cacioppo one more time for his lecture?